Representing transgender bodies in contemporary art. For visual culture, visibility is not so simple. Its object of study is precisely the entities that come into being at the points of intersection of visibility with social power, that is to say, visuality. Nick Mirzoff, The Subject of Visual Culture. Contemporary images of gender-ambiguous bodies by artists like Del La Grace Volcano, Linda Bemisser, and Jenny Saville, when considered in conjunction with the surprising success of the transgender film Boys Don't Cry, and the subcultural popularity of By Hook or by Crook, imply that the transgender body represents something particular about the historical moment within which it suddenly and spectacularly becomes visible. While the transgender body has been theorized as an in-between body, and as the place of the medical and scientific construction of gender, when it comes time to picture the transgender body in the flesh, it nearly always emerges as a transsexual body. In the images I consider here, the transgender body is not reducible to the transsexual body, and it retains the marks of its own ambiguity and ambivalence. If the transsexual body has been deliberately reorganized in order to invite certain gazes and shut down others, the transgender body performs self as gesture not as will, as possibility not as probability, as a relation, a wink, a handshake, and as an effect of deliberate misrecognition. In one particularly stunning example of the representation of transgender hybridity by way of faux collage, J.A. Nichols' paintings imagine transgenderism in the form of conglomerate creatures who emerge from the paint itself. In a painting titled In Another Place, for example, the body is postmodern surface, the very gesture of representation, and it struggles to emerge from the canvas enclosing its form. In Another Place splits the body into two non-complementary forms, each one in motion on the road to another place. Each figure stands on his or her own path, in his or her own place, and the two exchange a look that can never arrive. The roads that frame each hybrid body lead in different directions, and the two separated selves can never meet. The body itself in Nichols' painting is a collage form, but the collage is made up of not only different body parts, but different perspectives, a side view, full frontal, and different modes of representation. Resisting the traditional form of collage that draws other materials into the sphere of painting, Nichols creates the effect of collage with paint and canvas alone. She refuses the clear separation of the real and the represented that collage implies, and makes representation into a primary realm of signification. Nichols' work lies somewhere between abstraction and figural representation, marking out beautifully the other place of queer embodiment in contemporary aesthetics. Postmodernism and transgenderism. Postmodernism, as I proposed in Chapter 1, cannot simply be reduced to the cultural formations that accompany a new mode of capitalism. As Anna Singh points out, this kind of reductive reading of culture misunderstands the potential for cultural production to exceed and resist economic imperatives. Indeed, the assumption that cultural production will always only represent the dominant economic order erases the multiple disruptions to hegemony that have emerged from subcultural and avant-garde art practices in the past, and it leaves us with a sense of inevitability about our relation to the dominant. Debates about the relationship between the economy and art production, base and superstructure, have a long history in art criticism, and I attempt to revisit some of these debates here in order to refute the return of a Frankfurt School paradigm of cultural capitulations, on the one hand, and to define the political and aesthetic contributions made by ludic body artists to oppositional politics in postmodernism, on the other. In this chapter, I define postmodernism as the generative clash between new modes of cultural production and late capitalism. Within postmodernism, subcultural activities are as likely to generate new forms of protest as they are to produce new commodities to be absorbed back into a logic of accumulation, and new sites of opposition or geographies of resistance become available even as new modes of domination are formed. The link between transgenderism and postmodernism has emerged in a number of late 20th century, late 1900 philosophies of embodiment, from Judith Butler's Gender Trouble to Jean Baudrillard's essay Transsexuality, to Rita Felski's Transsexuality, Postmodernism, and the Death of History. Butler takes the transgender subject seriously and uses transgenderism to represent the contradictions of being, specifically gendered being, in postmodernism. Baudrillard, on the other hand, uses transsexuality and, by implication, transgenderism as simply a metaphor for the unlocatability of the body. For Baudrillard, no one actually inhabits transgender subjectivity. Rather, transgenderism represents the subject floating free of the body in cyberspace. And for Felsky, the fate of the transsexual body in postmodern theory spells out the death of history, in that transsexuality as an experience, as a specific history of gender and sexuality, has been cast as a disembodied, metaphoric signifier of pure difference. Felsky argues for an ethical account of difference that respects the specific historical locations of embodied forms in space and time. My account of the representations of transgendered bodies in this chapter takes heed of Felsky's challenge to remain attentive to disjuncture and non-synchrony in the experience of temporality, while simultaneously acknowledging systematic connections and relations among discrete cultural practices, and provides an account of the emergence of the transgender body within art in relation to the various histories of art making that have involved the visibly gendered body. The connection between postmodernism and transgenderism also makes an oblique and somewhat surprising appearance in Fredric Jameson's classic essay, The Cultural Logic of Postmodernism. In this essay, Jameson sounded the warning bell on a new form of cultural production, which, he believes, participates in a global cultural industry. Jameson noted that aesthetic production today has become integrated into commodity production generally. He was concerned to point out that the seemingly resistant and oppositional strains of postmodern cultural production, the blending of high and low culture, for example, or the inclusion and even foregrounding of sexually explicit material, were actually the marks of institutionalization rather than revolution, and he identified a postmodern aesthetic of pastiche with a consequent weakening of historicity. Jameson identified high modernism with the singular masterworks of artists like Vincent van Gogh and Edvard Munch, and postmodernism, for him, could be grasped through the easily reproduced silk screens of glamour icons by Andy Warhol. Jameson identifies political postmodern only in relation to the historical novels of E.L. Doctorow and, ultimately, expresses a pessimistic vision of the political utility of postmodern cultural production, a pessimism, moreover, that has been echoed in the work of other Marxist theorists like David Harvey, and that has been subtly blamed on the preponderance within postmodernism of a ludic and parochial body politics. As Mandy Merck has pointed out, Jameson's rigid identification of postmodernism with queer consumption and of modernism with heterosexual production is startling and troubling, and indeed, his essay depends utterly on a homophobic repudiation of the superficial, the depthless, and the spectacular. In his essay, Jameson sets up a binary division between postmodernism and modernism that, in its comparison of a Van Gogh painting called Peasant Shoes and a Warhol silk screen titled Diamond Dust Shoes, associates modernist work with politically urgent representations of working class and male labor, and postmodernist art with politically anemic representations of bourgeois and female leisure. Jameson deepens this contrast by noting the three-dimensionality of the painting versus the one-dimensionality of the silk-screened image. Van Gogh's shoes, he observes, are caked with mud and materiality. They are of history, nature, and the world. Meanwhile, Warhol's shoes are clean, new, manufactured. They speak only of consumption and luxury. Van Gogh's painting tells us about class struggle, exploitation, and historical process, while Warhol's image transmits only the triumph of global capitalism. In her reading of Jameson's art history lesson, Merck restores a queer history of sex work and gay community to Warhol's pile of unmatched footwear, and she situates Van Gogh's matched pair firmly in relation to the centrality of heterosexual domestic arrangements within the stability of capitalism. Jameson's narrative of aesthetic, and specifically queer, capitulation to the forces of consumption falters in the face of this buried other history, and his evolutionary cycle of cultural collusion with economic imperatives grinds to a halt. Surprisingly then, Jameson unwittingly offers a queer proposal as the only antidote to global capitalism. Jameson claims repeatedly that postmodern architecture is the best example of the sinister underside of postmodern cultural production. Of all the arts, he writes, architecture is the closest constitutively to the economic, with which, in the form of commissions and land values, it has a virtually unmediated relationship. And architecture, he proposes, serves as the clearest example of the momentous changes within late capitalism that have unsettled relations between subjects and objects. Postmodern architecture, Jameson alleges, constitutes a mutation in built space itself with which we humans have not kept pace. There has been a mutation in the object unaccompanied as yet by any equivalent mutation in the subject. Here, Jameson dips into the very body politics that he elsewhere seems to hold in such contempt. This spatial mutation, he argues, constitutes a form of postmodern evolution, and indeed, stands as something like an imperative to grow new organs, to expand our sensorium and our body to some new, yet unimaginable, perhaps ultimately impossible, dimensions. This utopian, technotopian, or spatially imaginative formulation of a body with new organs and expanded sensorium corresponds precisely to the new forms of embodiment that have come to be called transgender in certain queer communities. Apart from the patently homophobic rejection of postmodern cultural logics as queer and ludic, Jameson's casting of postmodern cultural production as a logic of late capitalism resonates with, and in many ways simply replicates, many of the early 20th century, 1900s, debates about art and politics. Jameson's essay, in some respects, is an update of Clement Greenberg's famous essay from 1939, Avant-Garde and Kitsch. Greenberg's piece is often located in art history as something of an anomaly in Greenberg's own output, given its avowedly Marxist emphasis and its critique of bourgeois culture. Later on, of course, Greenberg became the foremost defender of abstract art, and his work led the way to an association of modernist aesthetics with political autonomy and disinterestedness. And the early essay, in some sense, paves the way for later proposals by Greenberg about the subordination of ideology to form. Yet in Avant-Garde and Kitsch, Greenberg still has one eye on a utopian socialist future and the other on the growing global threat of fascism, and in this historical context, he defines the role of the avant-garde as not to experiment, but to find a path along which it would be possible to keep culture moving in the midst of ideological confusion and violence. Greenberg then contrasts and opposes the avant-garde to kitsch, which he associates with folk or rudimentary culture. Despite positing a seemingly clear-cut opposition between kitsch and the avant-garde, Greenberg does argue that kitsch and the avant-garde are simultaneous cultural phenomena, and that they can coexist organically in a stable society. But where fascism or demagoguery take hold, kitsch can provide the dictator with access to the masses. Greenberg writes, "The main trouble with avant-garde art and literature, from the point of view of the fascists and the Stalinists, is not that they are too critical, but that they are too innocent, that it is too difficult to inject effective propaganda into them, that kitsch is more pliable to this end. Kitsch keeps a dictator in closer contact with the soul of the people." Many critics have detailed what is wrong with Greenberg's delineation of the relations between avant-garde culture and kitsch, and as Thomas Crow summarizes it in his Modernism and Mass Culture in the Visual Arts, the critique of Greenbergian modernism is now well advanced and its defenders are scarce. But Crow goes on to re-examine contradictions in Greenberg's opus in order to recast the relationship between high and low cultures and modernism, as well as to demonstrate, in fact, the indebtedness of avant-garde cultural production to what Crow calls oppositional publics. T.J. Clark also returns to Greenberg in an essay titled Clement Greenberg's Theory of Art to propose other histories of the relationship between artistic production and political resistance. By tracing other, somewhat buried histories of modernism itself, Clark is able to claim that far from being totally disarmed by the rise of mass politics and publics, the avant-garde has regularly and rightly seen an advantage for art in the particular conditions of ideological confusion and violence under capitalism. Both Crow and Clark stop short of endorsing or even describing the cultural possibilities, as Clark puts it, of postmodernism, but both do reject completely the formalist solution to the problem of the commodification of art. I will return later to the provocative way that Crow rehistoricizes the relationship between subcultures and avant-garde cultural production as one way out of the retreat of art into formalism. But Clark's rejection of Greenbergian modernism also has appealed to my project in that he resists both the retreat into abstraction and grim, fatalistic conclusions about the function of art in late capitalism. As Clark reminds us forcefully, art wants to address someone, it wants something precise and extended to do, it wants resistance, it needs criteria, it will take risks in order to find them, including the risk of its own dissolution. Given the vehement rejections in art history of gloom and doom scenarios within which art either withdraws into a private world of abstraction or becomes completely complicit with capitalism, it is surprising to see the notion of an oppositional modernism overwhelmed by mass culture reassert itself so insistently in Jameson's essay without the accompaniment of an historical accounting by him of the relationship between art and capitalism, bourgeois avant-garde traditions and aristocratic patronage, mass culture and subcultural resistance. It is surprising, too, that a one-to-one relationship between capitalism and culture would emerge so strongly amongst Marxist critics of postmodernism, when even Friedrich Engels himself warned against seeing the economic situation as cause solely active, while everything else is just passive effect. Engels continues, "No, men make their history themselves, only they do so in a given environment." Just as Greenberg could only see kitsch as the debased alternative to a rigorously committed avant-garde tradition, so Jameson can only cast postmodern pastiche as a dehistoricized and depoliticized capitulation to an economic imperative. Our present, of course, is no longer the present that Jameson wrote about just a decade ago, and the new aesthetics he explored in the late 1980s have been upstaged by other aesthetic that does develop along the lines of pastiche but also exceeds it. And while for Jameson, a grand narrative of historicity allowed him to trace the passage from the modern to the postmodern, this new moment is characterized by the tumbling and uneven advent of an era of simultaneity and instantaneous communication. One aesthetic no longer follows neatly on from another, if it ever did, replacing it and critiquing it at the same time. Rather, one aesthetic collides with the next, and hyperrealism will compete and collude with high abstraction, which will supplement and contrast with the return of narrative and a new experimentalism. This overlap of styles signifies not cultural confusion, but an immense array of strategies deployed to make sense of and resist capitalism at a historical moment within which several generations can neither remember nor imagine the world otherwise. What constitutes the alternative now is, as Jameson predicted, a technotopic vision of space and flesh in a process of mutual mutation. But while for Jameson, hyperspace was always corporate space, for some postmodern artists, the creation of new bodies in an aesthetic realm offers a way to begin adapting to life after the death of the subject. In what follows, I want to trace the collision of postmodern space and postmodern embodiment in a technotopic aesthetic, or one that tests technological potentialities against the limits of a human body anchored in time and space, and that powerfully reimagines the relations between the organic and the machinic, the toxic and the domestic, the surgical and the cosmetic. In doing so, I will try to account for new relations between what was earlier called the avant-garde and contemporary subcultural production. While Marxists see the disappearance of the avant-garde accompanied by the rise of mass culture, in actuality, postmodernism elevates the subculture to the status of the avant-garde. Since the avant-garde no longer solely represents class interests and class contradictions, and since subcultures, as I will show in my next chapter, cannot be understood as simply the localized containment of class struggle, we need to rethink the definitions of advanced, subcultural, and mass cultural production in an age of diversified struggle and multiple hegemonies. Representations of the transgender body by both advanced and subcultural artists provide one arena for the examination of new dynamics of resistance.